Where does morality come from? What or who determines what is moral and what is immoral? What is right and what is wrong? What is good or what is bad? Does the individual decide for himself or herself? Or does the local society have its own morality, which is totally separate from the morality of a nearby society? Is morality absolute and universal? Or does it change from society to society and from culture to culture? And what does the existence of the idea of morality say about the existence of God? Does any concept of goodness, rightness, or wrongness require the corresponding concept of God? These are all very relevant questions in a discussion of morality and goodness and justice. And these are some of the questions that we will be attempting to answer tonight on this edition of Answers for a Thirsty World. Good evening, everyone. I'm Steve Van Horn. Every individual and every society have ideas of what is right and wrong, and what is moral and what is immoral, and what is just and unjust. But where do those ideas come from? Do they come from the individual? Do they come from the community or society? Or do they come from some higher source? Are they universal and objective, or are they only local? If they're local, do they ever change, or do they always remain the same? Are they absolute, or are they relative? Well, these are some tough questions, and to help us think about the answers is our guest tonight. Michael Gurney is a professor of ethics and philosophy at Multnomah Bible College here in Portland. So, Michael, I want to welcome to the program. Thank you for being with us tonight.
Thank you for having me, Steve.
And before we get started, there's a couple of things that I want to mention. And in a few minutes, we're going to be putting a phone number on the screen. And when we do that, that will be your invitation to call the program if you have questions, if you want something to be clarified, or if you have an opinion, or if you just want to discuss the matter with us. This is an important matter tonight. And it is something that deals with a philosophical issue. Ethics and morality, and where our morals and where our ethics come from. And so it's something that we all together are going to be thinking about, putting on our thinking caps tonight. And we'd encourage you to track with us, to think about what we're saying, and to really think through for yourself where your ethics come from, where your morality comes from, what the source is of those. And that's really what we want you to think about tonight and to be a part of the program as we go through this. So that's the invitation. When you see that phone number in a few minutes, that will be your invitation to call. Well, Michael, as we start tonight, just in a general way, is it fair to say that just about everybody has a concept of good and bad, moral and immoral, right and wrong? Is it fair to say that all of us have something like?
I think somebody who is cognitively functioning and is psychologically balanced. I think we all have a sense of right and wrong. I mean, even from a very young age. I mean, I have two young kids, and and any parent can tell you that kids have at a very young age a sense of justice. As exhibited by when they say, "Well, that's not fair." I mean, it may be a distorted sense of justice, but it's a sense of justice nonetheless. So yeah, I think we recognize we have these certain intuitions that pop up all the time in our interactions with people, and we have certain expectations about what people ought to do. We have a sense of when somebody cuts us off in the freeway that's not right. So yeah, I think it's pretty much across the board, most moral philosophers recognize. I think it's a pretty widely accepted that people have some kind of moral sense to them.
And so, if it's true that we all have some kind of a moral center, if we want to call it that, talk a little bit about the conflict of those, because it seems to me like if we look at society, look at the world, that our moral values are always butting heads with each other.
Sure.
So my question is there some, on a local level, I'm not talking, even on a philosophical level, are there thoughts that there's some right and wrong that's good for all of us, or is there a lot of debate going on in that area?
Well, I mean, historically, most people, I think, have operated with a sense of moral there's objective moral values. It's not really until more recently that that moral relativism has really kind of become the popular mindset. I mean, moral relativism has always existed, or the idea that right and wrong is dependent either on me or my society. But there's always been but even with that, there's always been a sense that we're right. Our sense of morality is right and superior to others, which implies some notion of objectivity. So yeah, and even today, I would say in contemporary philosophy, while moral relativism is very popular on a popular level, on a philosophical level, you'll find very few ethicists who will actually defend moral relativism itself, because there are some real problems with that.
So when we've been doing this show a long time, and when we have callers that call and they have opinions, and we would even ask the callers tonight that would call, is when they have an opinion, very often I will ask them, what is your source of authority?
Yeah.
And so even in the area of ethics, I would ask the same question of somebody, what is your source of authority? What do you take your information from? So let me just ask you that question. What are some of the categories that we might say people choose that they say, well, this is my source of authority, this is my source of authority, this is my source of authority. In the area of morality and ethics, what are some of those common sources?
I think we can really boil down to four primary categories: self, society, nature, and God. I think you can pretty much boil down there are various different conceptions within those categories, but I think this self, society, nature, and God are really the four primary categories.
That's something that you mentioned a few minutes ago. You talked about moral relativity.
Moral relativism, yes.
Relativism, and you said that's something that's relatively new.
Well, not relatively new, but I think in terms of its popularity.
Okay.
I mean, it's always existed. I mean, you can go all the way back to the ancient Greeks, and there were moral relativists. And even the term ethics itself has that connotation in terms of the original Greek. But I think that there's always been a sense as well that there is some kind of objective aspect to morality, and primarily because people thought, well, I have a superior view, or in order to operate in terms of our everyday interaction with people, it seems to me that we often presuppose in our interactions that something's right or wrong. I mean, if you're watching the news and you see children being tortured, you say, well, that's just not right. Or, you hear of a story of a while back there was a case of a woman who left her child in her car while she was in a casino, and the child died, and people were outraged. And it wasn't just religious people, it was even non-religious people said that mother had an obligation. She had responsibilities to that child. Well, where do those obligations and responsibilities come from? That applies some kind of notion of objectivity.
Okay. Now, you're using the term objectivity here.
Yes.
Are you putting objectivity and relativism in opposition to each other? So help us understand, just very simply, what you mean by those two terms, relativism, objectivity.
Right. Objectivity says that something, and when we say something is objective, what we are claiming is that is true regardless of whether a person believes it or not, regardless of their attitude towards that belief. So, for example, 1 + 1 = 2. It doesn't matter whether you believe it or not, it's still true. And you ought to be thankful next time you go to the bank. Or, for example, take a controversial topic like in science, the age of the universe. People can debate over the age of the universe, but that's very different than denying that there's an objective age of the universe.
Okay, well, let me ask you a question then, because this seems to be a part of the whole discussion then.
Sure.
Is that I may hold something to be objectively true, whether you believe it or not.
Right.
But if you disagree with what I'm saying, isn't it possible? I'm going to make it very simple.
Sure.
I'm going to say this piece of paper is white.
Okay.
And I believe that's objective truth.
Okay.
You look at it and you say, no, it's black. And to you, that's objective truth. So do objective truths then come into conflict with each other, depending on who it is that's saying that's objective truth?
No, that's where you get into relativism. The color of the paper is an objective fact. It may be that, and we may be both wrong about what the color of the paper is. See, because the color of the paper is not dependent on what I think it is. It's dependent on something else outside of me. And so that's what makes it objective.
Okay, then is it fair to say that whether it's in an academic society or just in a truth-seeking society,
Sure.
are all of us interested in finding that objective truth?
Well, we would hope so, but I think the reality is, I mean, even the best of us at times may not want to hear the facts or the truth of matter. Sometimes there's bad news, and we don't want to believe it. And I take it that all of us are outside of God, are imperfect in terms of our beliefs and our knowledge. I mean, I take it God is the only one who has perfect knowledge. The rest of us probably have false beliefs. So hopefully we're trying to gain true beliefs. But we are, and as a Christian, I would say we are finite beings and we are fallen beings. That means sin affects the way that we deal with our beliefs, and sometimes we are inclined to believe something not because it's true, but because it caters to our own self-interest.
So let me ask one other question then before we start looking at some of these in detail. Is it fair to say then that in the different theories of morality, that there are inside of the realm of relative theories, there's a certain grouping there, and that there might be another, I don't know how many, but there would be others in the objective morality? In other words, here's my question.
Yeah.
When we start dividing them up, and we're going to be looking at the society, self, nature,
Sure.
and so forth, are those all in what we would call relative? Are they all relative?
Not necessarily. I would say there's probably the two primary versions of relativism that you're most likely to encounter. One's called subjectivism, which says a moral belief is true if I believe it or take it to be true, or I want to believe it to be true. In other words, I define my own morality. So if, for example, take a hot topic like abortion. On a subjectivist view, abortion is right or wrong depending upon whether a particular individual believes it right or wrong. So, for example, if you happen to believe that abortion is wrong, then it's wrong for you. If I happen to believe that abortion is morally permissible, then it's morally permissible for me. So it's really dependent upon each individual whether it's right or wrong.
But here's my question. I'm going to come back to this again. And like I said to the viewers out there, I want you to really follow what we're talking about here, because I'm asking Michael some questions here to help me divide these categories and really understand what the debate is here. So follow along, if you will. So that person, the individual, and while we're talking about self, that's one of the sources of morality that we wanted to talk about. So there's a person that says abortion is not right. Another one says abortion is okay.
Right.
And so each of them have their own view. They are their own source of morality. Would both of them agree that there is an objective morality in the area of abortion that we should all be looking for? Or do we just say that's not an issue, it's relative, and there is no objective morality in that area?
Yeah, the subjectivist view would say it really is, all that we can talk about if we have a disagreement is how we feel. It'd be like you and I arguing about which is better, chocolate chip cookie dough ice cream or Rocky Road. Mm-hmm. It's a matter of taste or personal preference, which makes the subjectivist view very difficult, because the reality is that we don't function as isolated individuals. Our choices and actions and even our beliefs affect other people. So for example, if somebody believes that people who disagree with them, they have the right to kill them or hurt them, use force to convince them, and that's their moral system. And then they would go out and they would start pounding away on somebody because they disagreed with them. We'd say, well, wait a minute, that's not right. But on the subjectivist view, you really don't have any complaint. And so, most, like I said, most moral philosophers see that this is just unrealistic. If we're going to function as a society, there has to be some basis of something in common that we hold. Otherwise, it's total anarchy and chaos.
Right. Okay, let me put you on hold right there. I think we're going to go ahead and put the phone number up on the screen, and we invite you to call at this point. As we get into these things and you got the wheels cranking up there and there's some things that come to your mind and you'd like to ask some questions about this, we really invite you to call. We do ask that only those of you who have serious questions that you would call from time to time on this kind of a program. We get those who just want to ask something that's silly or even off color, and we'd prefer that you not do that, please. But we invite you to call if you have a serious question or want to talk about these matters, if something needs to be clarified. These are important issues about where our morality comes from, and we are heading in a direction, as you will see from the topic tonight, is if there is a morality, if there truly is morality, does that require belief in God? Can there be morality without God? And that's really the question tonight. We'd encourage you to call with your opinion on that, your thoughts on that, because we are heading in a direction that before the program's over, we hope to be able to explain to you that morality, if you say there is a morality, that there is right, there is wrong, then it requires a belief in a supernatural, a transcendent authority like God that would tell us what that morality is. And that's kind of the direction we're going. But we invite you to call and be a part of the conversation as we continue to discuss these matters. Let's just, I want to back up and just again clarify this issue. We're talking about one possibility of morality, or the center of morality, the source of morality, is the individual. Mm-hmm. Now that sounds to me, and you used the word anarchy there, that sounds to me like there is the potential of over 6 billion different moralities.
Sure. Because
there's over 6 billion people in the world.
Yeah, I mean, it would be like, I was in Pakistan one time, and I discovered there that in the traffic laws, in most countries you drive either on the left side or the right side, and there it was any side you can, which was, very chaotic. I mean, there were certain rules that govern you're driving on the road, but you can imagine the kind of the chaos, and that's what it would be like if morality was purely subjective, that it was just a matter of everybody's private, personal preference, just a matter of taste. I like this, so, and the hard thing, and the hard thing for a subjectivist, it might sound initially appealing, but then you could never ever complain about injustice. You could never ever say that somebody wronged you, because they're just doing their own morality. If subjectivism was true.
Now, is subjectivism the only form of self-originating morality?
Well, there are some other ones that aren't necessarily relativistic, but tend to be oriented towards the self. Mm-hmm. One's called ethical egoism, for example, that would say the rightness or the wrongness of an act is a function of one's own self-interest. So you have something like that, which isn't. It sounds very similar, but there are some. In fact, one version of ethical egoism is called objectivism. So that it gets really confusing, as you can imagine. And of course, Ayn Rand, who's a well-known, wrote Atlas Shrugged and Fountainhead. She was the proponent of this one, and she wrote a book, for example, called The Virtue of Selfishness, that would propose this idea. But that's not so much relativistic there.
So again, you were talking about. You said it's. What was the term you used?
Ethical egoism?
Yeah, ethical egoism, that everything is for self-interest. So even, and I'm thinking of somebody like Bill Gates.
Sure.
Who has been in the news the last few years, just giving millions of dollars to help with humanitarian aid and to do these types of things. And so the ethical egoist would say that he is doing that for his own benefit.
Sure.
How would that work?
Well, when I teach on this in my classes, I ask the students about why did you become a Christian, and ultimately their reasons are related to self-interest, and that's where I think ethical egoists make a mistake, because they say, well, since everybody operates out of self-interest, then that should be the basis of morality. the problem is self-interest isn't sufficient for morality. For example, I take it that most of us want to have genuine friendships. We want real friends. But what characterizes genuine friendship? It seems to me, at the very least, it involves give and take. And that means not always basing your actions and your friendship on your self-interest. Sometimes you sacrifice your self-interest to the interest of your friend. In fact, I would say the ideal ethical egoist is somebody who's narcissistic. And I think most of us...
Now, what's narcissistic?
Narcissistic is somebody who's extremely self-interested. In other words, the whole world revolves around them. At least they think so.
Love of self.
Yeah. And well, it's identified as a psychological condition. I mean, that's how negatively we view it in our culture. And plus, for example, you use the example of Bill Gates. I take it that, sure, he does it out of self-interest, but that's not the same as selfishness. See, and that's where I think sometimes people confuse those two. In fact, I take it if he was really selfish, then he would gain no pleasure in giving all that money. So it really wouldn't cater to his self-interest in that case. So there is a difference between self-interest, which I think is legitimate. For example, I think biblically, we're not told to sacrifice all our self-interest, but rather to subordinate our interests to those of the kingdom.
So what is wrong with that view?
What's wrong with ethical egoism? Well, it's really unrealizable. I mean, because ethical egoism is intended to be a system of ethics. It's intended to be a normative, we call it normative theory of ethics. That is a theory which we're not only saying I should practice, but everyone should practice. And one of the big problems that philosophers talk about with this is that oftentimes you may have competing interests with somebody else. And I mean, quite simply, if you're encouraging other people to seek out their own self-interest, that may encroach on your self-interest. So it seems hard at times to promote it as a normative ethical system because...
Can you think of an example?
Well, the example I often use in the classroom is I tell my students, let's suppose I tell you at the beginning of the semester that one of you, whoever gets the top grade in the class, will get a scholarship. They'll get an A and they'll get a scholarship. They'll pay for the rest of their entire education. All the rest of them will fail. Now, are you going to study with your classmates? Are you going to encourage them to study? And it's obvious that you wouldn't. I mean, you wouldn't want to.
Right.
In fact, people can be pretty devious and try to mess their classmates up. So it really becomes very problematic in that it becomes very self-centered. And so once again, it goes from being self-interested, which is, I think, a valid notion, to being selfishness, self-centered.
So it could be a source of morality, but it is going to cause problems in relationships, society, and down the road there's going to be some...
Right, self-interest is a valid... for example, if you're making a difficult medical decision, obviously one of the things you want to think about is what's in the best interest for me in terms of my physical well-being. That's a very valid moral consideration.
Okay, so there's another view then. What was one of the other views that we talked about at the beginning?
Well, we talked about society. Yeah.
Society. So what's that all about? We've looked at the fact that, and by the way, there's a phone number there on the screen, and again we invite you to call, and really what we would like you to think about and even share with us is whatever morality that you hold to. What is the source of that morality? And we don't want to challenge your morality per se, but we would like to hear from you where your morality comes from, what source you go back to as your morality, as your code of ethics, so to speak. So that's what we're talking about. We've said it could be self. The other one is society.
Yeah, society.
What do you mean by that?
Well, in fact, I would say it's a more common version of relativism, which says that what's right and what's wrong is really a function of a particular society. So, for example, and this was, I think, really encouraged in the early 1900s with the emergence of cultural anthropology, when cultural anthropologists would go around and see different societies. So in one society, say like ours, polygamy is considered not only immoral, but illegal. But there's other societies, say, for example, on a Polynesian island, where polygamy not only is seen as morally permissible, but it's even seen as virtuous. In other words, the people who have multiple wives, it's a sign of wealth and power. and a prestige. So what we call it, the technical term is conventionalism. That view would say, well, for that society, if you grow up in the society, say the Polynesian island society, where polygamy is practiced, then it's okay for that society. Whereas in our society, it's not okay, so it's wrong for you to practice polygamy.
So that sounds reasonable, because just for the example that you've used there. So what are some of the problems then?
Yeah, there are some really, it initially sounds very appealing, but one of the first questions we have to ask is, well, what constitutes a society? I mean, take the polygamy example.
Right.
There are people in this country. Take, for example, there are fundamentalist Latter-day Saints, fundamentalist Mormons, who believe that not only is polygamy permissible, it's in fact a part of their religious beliefs. Now, I take it that I know that there's more than just one or two fundamentalist Mormons out there. Are they not a society? And if they are a society and they believe that polygamy is right, then how can we say it's wrong? Well, and of course the problem is because they are American citizens. And here's where we run into problems, because oftentimes, in fact, I think all of us belong to multiple societies.
And so we're defining a society of just how would you define society?
Well, that's the problem. It's a very ambiguous notion, and so as a consequence, and since the whole moral relativist view of conventionalism depends upon this idea of society, but since it's so vague, then you run into these problems where you have competing societies who have different competing theories about, or competing ideas about what is moral. Or to give another example, we in World War II, the United States and the Allies invaded Germany. Invaded Europe and eventually got into Germany. When we got into Germany, we discovered these camps where millions of Jews and other people were slaughtered, and experiments were performed on them. And we said that is morally, that's horrible. It's just, is anybody going to defend the Holocaust as being morally permissible? And yet, Germany in the 1930s and 40s, under the influence of Adolf Hitler and his ideology, he convinced the German people, the majority of the German people, that in fact the Jews were a problem to their society, and that they, as good Germans, it was their moral duty to participate in this genocide of Jews. Now, that was a society. Mm-hmm. And once again, if conventionalism is true, then you really, if you were to be taken in a time machine and transported back to the 1930s, how could you tell a Jew or a German citizen that he should not turn in his Jewish neighbors? Because he's being told by his government, and he believes it, that this is his moral duty, and that's his moral code.
Well, if there were, and here's maybe part of the conflict, if there were Jews living in that country,
right?
I don't want to say society, I want to say country, and couldn't the Jews, by the definition we're talking about there, then be classified as their own separate society?
And that's where we get, and this is where it gets.
And see, so we're talking about here's the rest of the German society, and the Hitler, we'll call it the Hitler-led society. Now you've got this Jewish society living inside of this other, and so that's what we're talking about
right.
there.
And in fact, there were German Christians, for example, who resisted the Nazis. And once again, they were a society too, and yet they were German citizens.
And so you get to the point where there's societies within societies, overlapping societies, and how many societies can one person be a member of?
Yeah,
and if you're a member of two joining societies, and the two societies have different moral views, then you're in conflict.
There's no way to resolve the conflict. There's another problem, and that is what's called the moral reformer's dilemma. We take people like Martin Luther King and William Wilberforce and Gandhi as moral reformers, as heroes. We take them as great moral heroes.
Right.
And yet, if conventionalism is true, if morality is dictated by the societies...
And we just want everybody to understand that conventionalism means that society is
Society dictates what's right and wrong.
Okay.
But once again, what does a moral reformer do? They try to reform that society. See? So what are they doing? They're going against what society says is moral. Take Martin Luther King. He was saying, look, African Americans should be treated equally. They should be, there should be no, they should have equal access as American citizens. They are human beings, and therefore they should not be treated any differently. And yet society, in American society, unfortunately was saying, no, if you're African American, at least in certain parts of the country, you cannot drink at this water fountain.
And so they're seen as heroes. They're celebrated
Martin
as
Luther King,
heroes.
Yeah. Well, at least we do today.
Yeah, right. Yes, that's what I'm saying today. And yet there would be others, and I'm not thinking of any names in particular right now, but others would come along and want to change society,
right.
And they are pushed back, and they're seen as villains.
Right. Well,
and so it would seem to me like when you take a step back and look at it now, that some people would say that the virtue and morality of a Martin Luther King was more welcome or was more acceptable looking back than the morality of the society.
Right, but let's not miss the point, though, because once again, if society tells us what's right and wrong,
right,
then we are obligated to follow what society says. To try to change what society says is automatically wrong if morality is dictated by society.
So, okay, I just want to restate what I hear you saying. Is what you're saying is if the society I am in says this is right and this is wrong, then, and I'm in agreement with my society, then I need to.
Well, it's not a matter whether, because once again, on the conventionalist view, you are wrong if you go against society.
Okay.
See, that's the kick. That's the tension there, and that's what.
And so, like a Martin Luther King, he is resisting what the society has told him.
And he automatically becomes a moral villain. Mm-hmm. On a conventionalist view.
Until he that's what's interesting, until it's converted,
right.
And now all of a sudden he becomes a hero.
But the problem is you can never convert it, because to convert it you have to initiate change, but you can't initiate change because to try to initiate change is itself wrong.
Yeah.
See, and that's a real problem for this conventionalist view. In fact, what the conventionalist view tells you is what your moral responsibilities are is to follow along with society. But the problem is, you go back to the Nazis example. We found that as inexcusable for those guards at those concentration camps who just said, "Well, we're just following orders," and society said, or the world said, that's not acceptable. That's not an acceptable excuse. Why? Because you may have be given that order, but you know that that's wrong.
So what is the conventionalist, the one who says society is the one that decides what's right and wrong? What does the conventionalist say at the end of the process, 10, 20, 30 years later, when that society has been changed and now there's a new ethic or a new morality? How did they deal with that? Do they now accept?
Well, if they're a good conventionalist, they just go with whatever the society says. But like I said, and that's whether, for example, if you lived in Germany once again in the 1920s, and all of a sudden, when Hitler takes over, being a good conventionalist, that society dictates what's right and wrong, then you would become a Nazi.
So then the conventionalist would say that even though there is a set of right and wrong inside that society, that there is a possibility that could all change in a generation and we would have a new set of what is right and wrong.
Well, the problem with that is you can't really have change if everybody's a faithful conventionalist. Because once again, if you are a conventionalist, true blue conventionalist, and are committed to following the moral dictates of that society, then you're not going to want to change it.
Okay. I just want to apologize to everybody that's out there because I'm on a track right here, right now. But here's my point. Let's say that I'm going to just try 50 years ago, we're living in a society where there was racism before Martin Luther King. Okay? And I was alive then, and I said the society's rights and wrongs is what I hold to.
Right.
Now, 50 years later, society is saying that what I believed 50 years ago was wrong. Do I still say, no, it was right? It is still right. It is still right.
I think you would be very morally confused because you're just going to go with whatever the society says. See, because once again, you're on a conventionalist view, your only moral obligation is to follow society. So you're not, and that's where it becomes very incoherent.
And so we're back to this term that we started with, objectivity. The conventionalists would say that there is no objective morality. There is not something that is going to be Right. Okay. What about another? This is sorry to those of you who are out there. This is interesting to me. I hope you're following what we're talking about. The other one is what was the other one we talked about? Nature. Nature as being a possible source. What's that all about?
Well, I mean, there are several different versions of this. Some would argue that human nature itself, and on this view, this could be an objectivist ethic. There are some who would argue that we all have as humans certain natural needs like water, food, shelter, and so we can develop a moral system based upon that. In other words, so for example, I think I used the earlier situation where you have a woman who leaves her child in a car by itself, and it overheats. It doesn't, it kills it. We all recognize that as humans, physiologically, we cannot be exposed to high temperatures for long periods of time. So we could say that would be an objective grounds to say what she did was wrong. The problem is, how do we establish I think we can develop certain moral principles from that, but it seems rather inadequate. For example, one could argue that, say for example, a pedophile says, I have certain natural desires towards children in a sexual way. Well, if we base it solely on natural desires, on nature, it would be hard to say, why is it wrong for him to engage in sexual interactions with children? So it seems to me that trying to base it strictly on human nature and needs is not an adequate basis for morality.
Okay, well, I want to transition into our last option here that we want to talk about tonight. But again, if you want to be a part of the discussion, if you have a question for Michael, if some of these things have gone by you in a hurry, we told you at the beginning of the show it's something we want you to think about, and hopefully you have been thinking about it tonight, and these things have got your wheels to turning. If that's been the case, we're happy for that. So we've got a few more minutes in the show, and if you have a question, if you want to discuss where you believe that your moral values have come from, and if that works for you, we'd like you to think about that and maybe share it with us. Michael, the last thing that we want to talk about, there's a view, and we wanted to get to this, and you call it what? Moral objectivism? Is that?
Right. Moral objectivism is the belief that there are objective moral principles and values.
Now again, moral objectivity, I just want people to understand that that's something that, again, define objectivity.
Right. Objectivity means that an objective fact or an objective idea is one that's true.
All the time?
All the time, whether one believes it or not.
Okay.
Okay. Now, when you say all the time, we have to be careful here because sometimes there may be a question about when it's applicable.
Okay.
Okay.
All right.
But once again, what we're saying is that just like we talk about objective scientific facts,
right,
or objective historical facts, like Lincoln wrote the Gettysburg Address. It's either true or it's not true that Lincoln gave the Gettysburg Address. And the truth of that is not dependent upon whether I believe it or you believe it.
Or the society.
Or the society believes. In fact, it may turn out that we're all wrong. Suppose, for example, this was a hoax. And sometimes that does happen. You have these people who perpetuate hoaxes and, convince people that, or the example I like to use is Bigfoot, being in the Northwest. Does Bigfoot exist? Well, it's an objective fact whether or not Bigfoot exists. Now, we may not be able to ascertain whether that fact is true, but our inability to ascertain whether that fact is true or not does not change the objectivity of the fact. Mm-hmm. So we have to be very careful about this. So sometimes, especially when we get into morality, sometimes we get into these moral issues that are very complicated, and there's going to be a lot of disagreement. But once again, when I'm arguing, if moral objectivism is true, and that there are objective moral principles, that is, they are independent of whether I believe them to be true or not, or whether you believe them true, or whether society does, then the fact that we disagree doesn't disprove that there are objective moral principles.
So let's get right down to the bottom line, because I want us to get there and have time to discuss it. The question that we're talking about tonight is, does morality require belief in God?
Yeah.
And I think we're talking about objective morality.
Right. If there, once again, if there is objective morality, then that would require a source. Now, if it's objective, then it can't be self, and it can't be society. And once again, some have tried to argue that it's nature, but I think there's some real problems with that. So to me, the most plausible explanation is God. Now, we have to be very careful here, because I want to make a distinction here. I don't want to say that objective morality, that it requires belief in God, because I think that there are atheists out there who are moral people. I've met some. They try to be very moral people. So I'm not saying that you have to believe in God to be moral. What I'm saying is, what is the basis for morality?
So we're back to source again, and
Exactly.
That's what we talked about right at the beginning. Is as we've talked to people and said, "What is your source of truth?" We're asking tonight, "What is the source of your morality?"
Exactly.
And what you're saying is, if there is any morality at all, objective morality,
There's objective morality.
then
The most plausible explanation
There's
would
got to
be-
be a source.
Yeah.
There's got to be a source.
And it has to be the kind of source. I mean, and here's what I think one of the
It needs
problems.
to be a moral source.
Well, I mean, it has to be, because to me, the nature view is problematic in that take for example, there was a few years ago, there was a rock that rolled down a cliffside and crushed a car and killed the occupants of the car. And, we didn't put the rock in jail. Why? Because rocks are not moral agents. They're not, we don't attribute moral qualities to impersonal objects. So morality requires a personal agent or a person. So it seems to me that if you want to attribute morality to nature, and you take nature to be, impersonal, which most of us do, then that's hard to see how we could get morality out of something that's impersonal. So it seems to require a person, but it requires the kind of person that can transcend the particular cultures and time periods.
In societies,
And individuals,
Uh-huh.
and to whom we would be obligated to submit to. In other words, that we would have some kind of moral obligation to obey. Well, it seems to me that those kind of characteristics are best satisfied by God. Because if you try to pick out a particular individual, say a very wise man, why should I believe him? I mean, why should I take his views as being the objective truth? I mean, even if he's very intelligent, because once again, all of us are cultural creatures. All of us live in a particular cultural context. So there has to be someone who is able to transcend all the particularities and idiosyncratic characteristics of their particular culture in which they live in the particular time period.
So if we were to turn that around, let's just flip this whole thing over and say, is what I'm saying accurate? If there is no God, there is no objective morality.
Right.
Okay? If there's not objective morality, now it comes down to who's going to define what's right and wrong, and that's going to create all kinds of conflicts no matter what we go back to.
And that was exactly the view of somebody like Nietzsche. Nietzsche saw that so well. That's, if you're familiar with Thus Spake Zarathustra, or some of his other writings.
Oh, one of my favorite. Never heard of it.
God is dead. Well, if God is
now
dead,
that I'm from that,
then really there are no transcendent values.
Right.
Now, I mean, there are people who try to make the case. I mean, like I said, there are people who try to ground it in nature. But I think let me give you a quote from Michael Rutz, who is a well-known philosopher of science. He's an evolutionist. He's done a lot of work in this area on what's called evolutionary ethics. And listen to what he says. He says, what I believe is that claim of normative ethics are like the rules of a game. In baseball, it is true that after 3 strikes, the batter's out. But this claim does not have any reference or correspondence in absolute reality. What right have I to say, as an evolutionist, that normative ethics has no foundation? I have argued that normative ethics is a biological adaptation, and that's a fairly standard view in evolutionary ethics. And I would argue that as such, it can be seen to have no being or reality beyond this. We believe normative ethics for our own biological good, and that is that. I mean, that's, I think, a very articulate and succinct statement that says, if we try to ground morality and some objective notion of morality in evolution, in some kind of naturalistic evolution or some kind of natural condition, it becomes rather, there's no real reason why I should, why should I help a little old lady cross the street? if, in fact, I determine that little old lady is actually a hindrance to the survivability of our species. So instead of helping her cross the street, I push her out in front of the bus. And if I can make an argument that's for my own biological species, that's good for my own biological species, that seems like a good reason. And yet I think all of us would say, if somebody does that, that's wrong. You don't need to be an ethicist. You don't need to be an ethics professor to figure that out.
So if there's no objective morality, what is the result? Chaos? I mean, when you come right down to it, it gets down to the survival of the fittest, the one in power that dictates the rules and the morality, and that's really what you come down to, isn't it?
It's interesting to me because I think what we see in our society, and it goes back to what we talked about at the very beginning, I take it that we all have these moral intuitions, and I think they're all given to us by God, whether you're an atheist or a believer in God or what have you, that we have this sense of right and wrong, and I think that constrains us, and that's why I think we find we don't always act as what we believe, especially if you're a moral relativist. I've never met a moral relativist that was consistent in their moral relativism, because even moral relativists that I know complain about injustice, have a sense of duty and obligation to their children. So it's to me there's that very strong intuition. So luckily for us, we have those intuitions that prevents us from descending into moral chaos and anarchy.
And that's something I wanted to end with tonight. Tonight we have been talking about morality, right and wrong, good and bad, justice and injustice, and we've been discussing the question of where all of that comes from. And what we are proposing right now, what we both believe very strongly, is that all objective morality comes from who we call God, a creator, someone who is transcendent, someone who is above society, above the individual, and who has a morality that he wants us to live by. And I would like to share some verses out of the Bible that I think make this very clear and describe some of the things that you and I have been talking about. And they all come out of the book of Romans. And in Romans chapter 1, verse 20 and 21, it says, "For since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood through what has been made, and they are without excuse," meaning his creation, his creatures, we're without excuse, that he has revealed himself in nature, in his creation. "For even though they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks, but they became futile in their speculations, and in their foolish heart was darkened. Professing to be wise, they became fools." The point that I want to make is that God has revealed himself to us in nature. Then in Romans chapter 2, verses 14 and 16, this is what we're talking about here. "For when the Gentiles who did not have the law," and what he's talking about there is in the Old Testament, God gave a written law to the Jews, a part of which is the Ten Commandments, but the Gentiles did not have a written law. But it says, "For when the Gentiles who do not have the law instinctively do the things written in the law, thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not commit adultery, thou shalt not bear false witness," and so forth. "When they instinctively do the things of the law, these not having the law are law to themselves, in that they show the work of the law written in their hearts, their conscience bearing witness." And this is what we're talking about, that each of us has an inner knowledge of what is right and wrong, and it's there at birth. And that as we grow, it is developed. Some people may say that when we are born, we're like a white slate, blank slate, and that our surroundings start dictating what is right and wrong. But what the Bible is saying is it's there.
Yeah.
It's there already. And then our environment, our society may start tweaking it and shaping it and pushing it in a different direction. But it's there to begin with, and it's there by God. Then in chapter 3, verse 23, it says that all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. And what this is talking about here is that God has revealed himself to us in nature, that he has put within us a knowledge of himself. And then it says in chapter 1, going back to those verses again, it says that even though they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks, but became futile in their speculations, which is exactly what the world has done, trying to be smarter than God, so to speak, and has pressed down that knowledge. Well, that's sin. It's falling short of the glory of God. God has placed this knowledge of good and evil in our conscience, but we've ignored it. Then, in Romans chapter 5 and verse 8, it says that God demonstrates his own love towards us in that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. So God recognized what had happened, and God knew that we were separated from him because of our sin, because we have rejected him. All of us have. Every society, every individual has rejected God. And so, but God demonstrated his own love for us in that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. Now, I want to slow down here for just a minute. I want to read one other verse. And that's in Romans chapter 6, verse 23. It says, "The wages of sin is death, but the free gift of God is eternal life through Jesus Christ our Lord." So, Mike, I want to try to put all this together for our viewers. We're talking tonight about morality and where morality comes from. But more importantly is why morality is significant.
Yeah.
Well,
You know, William James.
and we've got about 2 or 3 minutes, so just real quickly.
William James wrote a book called The Varieties of Religious Experience. Came out around the early 1900s. Very influential, one of the founders of psychology, well-known philosopher. One of the things he points out in that book is that when he looks across the religious spectrum, everyone has a sense of indebtedness to some kind of transcendent being. And I think that illustrates that we have this awareness that we are inadequate. I was in a debate several years ago at Oregon State University, and I asked the audience, is there anyone here who can claim to be morally perfect? Not a single person raised their hand, and I doubt anybody would. Because, I mean, I'm sure if anybody raised their hand, their friend could go, yeah, right. You know, I mean, it's the fact is we all recognize that we are morally we're far from morally perfect. And that, I think, demonstrates, and that realization is so important when we talk about the gospel. Because if we, sometimes I hear people say, well, I don't need a Savior. Because they don't think that they're in a state of sin. And people are in denial. But it's not hard to demonstrate that all of us, Christians included, fall way short. We need God's grace. We need what Jesus did on the cross.
And when you talk about anybody saying that they don't need a Savior, that would say to me that that person thinks, well, I'm okay. But that goes back to your source of morality.
Yeah. Well, it goes back to your standard, doesn't it?
Yeah. If you go back, if you say, well, I am the standard of morality. If you were all like me, you'd be okay.
Or if we have our standards so low. In other words, I hear a lot of people say, well, I've never murdered anybody, but have you lied? If we set our standard, and once again, if the standard is moral perfection, and which we take God to be, if God is not morally perfect, then how could he be our source of morality? See, and so but if God does exist and he's a standard of moral perfection, then that points out to the fact that we fall way short of that.
Yeah, let me read one other thing here, and this is just exactly what you're talking about there. In Romans chapter 10, verse 3, this is exactly what you just said. He's talking about the Romans there, and it says, "For not knowing about God's righteousness and seeking to establish their own, they did not subject themselves to the righteousness of God." And that's exactly what happens. And I want to wrap up things this way, that There is a righteous, holy God that has communicated with us and has given all of us a basic knowledge of good and evil from the beginning. And He has given us a conscience. And early in our lives, we experience guilt when we do something that is wrong, and then we have to decide what to do about that. And for the most part, individuals and societies have redefined what's right and wrong. They have just ignored the guilt. They have suppressed the knowledge of God. They've said, well, I don't believe in God. They've done everything they can to try to get rid of that feeling of guilt. But God has given us that feeling for a purpose, because He sent Jesus Christ to die on the cross for us. The only way we will ever have a relationship with Him is by being forgiven of our sin. And that's why Jesus Christ died. So if you would if this has made sense to you tonight, if you would like to have a personal relationship with Christ, simply confess to God that you're separated from Him because of your sin. Recognize that Jesus Christ died on the cross for you, and then invite Christ to come into your life to take control and to make you what He wants you to be. And He'll do that, as He promised. Michael, thank you for being with us tonight.
Well, thank you for having me.
And we'll have you back again when we want to clear the cobwebs out.